The shuttle from Earth docked at Station Harmony 7, with a soft hiss of pressure equalization, and the students waiting in the arrival bay held their breath. Without realizing they were doing it, Una Park stepped through the airlock carrying nothing but a single gray bag over her shoulder, and for a moment, nobody moved at all. She was smaller than they expected, and that was the first surprise, because the stories about Deathworlders always made them sound like giants and monsters, but this human female stood barely 5.5 feet tall with black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The second surprise was how quiet she was. A Volante student named Mira had been assigned as her guide, and she stepped forward on her long, graceful legs, trying to keep her voice steady as she spoke in Galactic Common. "Welcome to the Academy, and I am Mira, and I will show you to your quarters." Una nodded once and said thank you in a voice so soft that Mira had to lean closer to hear it. The crowd of students parted as they walked, and Una pretended not to notice how they pressed themselves against the walls and how their eyes followed her like she was something dangerous that might attack at any moment. She had read all the files before coming here, and she understood what she represented to these people, from their gentle worlds with their low gravity and their calm atmospheres and their careful, controlled environments. To them, Earth was a nightmare planet, a world where the gravity crushed bones and the atmosphere burned lungs, and predators hunted in every shadow, and diseases mutated faster than medicine could cure them, and natural disasters struck without warning. And even the plants had learned to fight back against anything that tried to eat them. To them, humans were survivors of a war that never ended, and that made them terrifying. Myra kept exactly 3 meters of distance as they walked through corridors made of pale blue metal and soft lighting designed to be comfortable for dozens of different species. "A dormitory is in the low-gravity wing," said Mira, and her translator gave her voice a slight mechanical quality because she actually spoke in whistles and clicks that human ears could not properly interpret, "and we assumed you would want standard gravity is fine," said Una, and Mira stopped mid-sentence with her mouth still open. "Standard gravity," repeated Mira, as if she had not heard correctly. Una almost smiled, but not quite, and said, "I am used to it." They walked in silence after that, and Mira kept glancing at the human girl beside her and trying to understand how something so small and so quiet could come from a world that the Galactic database classified as a Category 12 death environment. The dormitory was a small room with a bed and a desk and a window that looked out at the stars, and Una set her bag down and stood very still for a moment, just looking at the view. "Is it acceptable?" asked Myra from the doorway, because she was not quite ready to step inside the same room as a Deathworlder. "It is perfect," said Una, and she meant it because she had grown up in the reclamation zones of what used to be called Korea, and her childhood bedroom had been a converted storage container with no windows at all. Myra nodded quickly and said, "Orientation begins tomorrow at the 7th hour, and I will come to collect you," and then she was gone before Una could say anything else. Una sat on the edge of her bed and let out a long, slow breath. She had known this would be hard, and her parents had warned her, and the counselors at the Earth Embassy had prepared her for the isolation and the fear, and the way other species would look at her, like she was a weapon that might go off any moment. But knowing something and feeling it were two different things, she unpacked her bag slowly, and there was not much inside because Earth students were only allowed to bring approved items through customs, and most of what she owned had been flagged as potentially dangerous. A change of clothes and a datapad and a small photograph of her family and a worn paperback book that had belonged to her grandmother. The book was called The Art of War, and it was over 2,000 years old, and her grandmother had given it to her on the day she left for the academy. "Remember who you are," her grandmother had said in Korean, because she refused to speak any other language, "and remember where you come from, and remember that fear is just weather, and you dress for weather, Una, and you do not let it stop you from walking outside." Yuna touched the cover of the book and then placed it carefully in the drawer beside her bed. 3 floors above her, in a security monitoring room that was not supposed to exist, a tall figure with pale skin and bioluminescent markings studied a holographic display that showed the human girl unpacking her belongings. "Confirm identity," said the figure in a voice like static. The second figure at the control panel pulled up data streams and cross-referenced facial recognition and biometric signatures, and finally said confirmed, and she's the daughter of Dr. David Park, the physicist, yes, and the one who designed the gravity well weapons for the Earth Defense Coalition. The first figure leaned closer to the display and watched Yuna place the old book in her drawer, and there was something in the way she moved that bothered him, but he could not quite identify what it was. "The Syndicate wants her," said the third figure from the shadows near the door. "Alive?" asked the first figure. "Alive, confirmed. And for now, and we watch, and we wait, and we learn her patterns. And when the moment is right, we take her, and her father will give us everything we want to get her back." The first figure nodded slowly and kept watching the display, and the small human girl sat very still on her bed and looked out at the stars. And she did not look dangerous at all, but something still bothered him. It was the way she had entered the room, and the way her eyes had moved across every surface and every corner and every shadow before she set down her bag, and it was the way she had positioned herself with her back to the wall and the door in her line of sight. It was the way she sat now with her weight balanced and her hands relaxed but ready. It was the way she never once looked at the hidden camera in the ceiling, but also never turned her back to it, almost like she knew it was there. "No," said the first figure to himself, and shook his head, because that was impossible. And she was just a 17-year-old student from a Deathworld, and she could not possibly know about the surveillance systems that even the Academy staff did not know existed. He was wrong. Yuna Park knew exactly where the camera was hidden, and she had known since the moment she walked through the door, because her grandmother had trained her to notice such things since she was old enough to walk. But she did not look at it. She sat on her bed and looked at the stars and let whoever was watching believe that she was just a small, quiet girl from Earth who wanted to learn and make friends and prove that humans could be trusted. She let them believe that because belief was a weapon too. And Yuna Park had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing in any room was not the biggest or the loudest thing. It was the thing that everyone underestimated outside. Her window, the stars burned cold and distant, and somewhere in the station, 3 hunters began planning how to catch a girl from a Deathworld. They did not know that she was already planning too. 3 weeks passed at the academy, and Yuna Park became invisible. She attended every lecture and sat in the back row and took notes on her datapad, and never raised her hand, and never asked questions, and never drew attention to herself in any way. The other students learned to ignore her the way you ignore a piece of furniture that has always been there, and she preferred it that way because invisible people could watch and learn and understand things that visible people never noticed. She learned that the Volanthi were graceful but fragile, and their bones were hollow like birds, and they came from a world with gravity so low that a human child could jump over their tallest buildings. She learned that the Keth were hunters from a cold, dark moon, and they could see in complete darkness, and their skin glowed with bioluminescent patterns that changed with their moods, and they were proud and cruel, and they looked down on every other species as weak. She learned that the station had 17 different security systems and 42 hidden cameras and 3 maintenance tunnels that were not on any official map, and she learned all of this without ever asking a single question. Tommy Lee found her in the cafeteria on the 18th day. Was the only other human at the academy, and he was everything Yuna was not, and he was loud and friendly and smiled at everyone and made jokes that sometimes translated properly and sometimes did not, and he had already made more friends in 2 weeks than Yuna would probably make in her entire life. "Hey, Deathworld buddy," he said, and dropped into the seat across from her without asking permission, and his tray was loaded with food that the Station kitchens had synthesized to match Earth nutritional requirements, and it looked almost but not quite like real food. Yuna looked up from her datapad and said hello. Tommy, he grinned at her and said, "You know you're allowed to talk to people, right? And it's not against the rules or anything, I." "Talk to people," said Yunano. "You answer questions when teachers call on you, and that is different. And talking to people means having conversations and making friends, and not eating alone every single day." Yuna considered this for a moment and then said, "I'm having a conversation with you right now." Tommy laughed, and it was a big warm sound that made several nearby students turn to look, and some of them even smiled, because Tommy Lee had that effect on people. "Fair enough," he said, and took a huge bite of something that was supposed to be a sandwich and chewed thoughtfully, and then said, "So what is your deal anyway?" "Deal, yeah, and like, why are you here, and what do you want to study, and where are you from on Earth, and do you have any hobbies, and and normal getting to know you stuff." Yuna set down her datapad and looked at him carefully, and Tommy had the sudden, uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing more than he wanted to show. "I am from the reclamation zones," she said, "and my father is a physicist, and my mother is a botanist, and I am here to study xenochemistry, and I do not have hobbies." Tommy blinked and said, "The reclamation zones, and that is the bad part, right?" Yuna almost smiled and said, "There are no good parts, Tommy, and Earth is Earth, and some parts are just more Earth than others." He did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and kept eating. And after a while he said, "They're scared of you, right?" "Yes, does that bother?" Yuna picked up her datapad again, and her dark eyes reflected the glow of the screen, and she said, "My grandmother survived the soul collapse, and my mother grew up in the reclamation zones, and my father lost his entire family to the Pacific outbreak when he was 9 years old, and fear is just weather, Tommy, and you learn to dress for it." Tommy stared at her for a long moment, and then said quietly, "What happened to make you so old?" Yuna looked up at him, and for just a second, he saw something in her eyes that made him shiver, and it was not anger or sadness, but something deeper and harder and older than any 17-year-old should carry. "Earth happened," she said, and then she went back to her datapad, and Tommy understood that the conversation was over. But he came back the next day, and the day after that, and slowly over the following weeks they became something like friends. Yuna did not tell him about the camera in the cafeteria ceiling that had started tracking her movements on day 3. She did not tell him about the maintenance drone that followed her between classes and always stayed exactly 12 meters behind her. She did not tell him about the 3 Keth she had noticed watching her from a distance, and how they rotated their surveillance in 6-hour shifts, and how they thought they were being subtle, but they were not. She did not tell him because Tommy was kind and good, and he deserved to stay that way, and some knowledge changed you, and she did not want to change him. On the night before everything fell apart, Yuna sat in her room and looked at her grandmother's book and thought about what was coming. She had mapped the patterns and learned the schedules and identified the threat, and now she just had to decide what to do about it. The smart thing would be to report it to station security and let them handle it, and stay safe and stay invisible, and let someone else deal with the danger. But Unipark was not built for smart. She was built for survival, and survival on Earth meant something different than it did anywhere else in the galaxy. And it meant that sometimes you had to show your teeth. And it meant that sometimes you had to teach predators that you were not prey. And it meant that sometimes the only way to stay safe was to make everyone afraid of what would happen if they touched you. Her grandmother had taught her that. Her grandmother had also taught her that the best fight was the one your enemy never saw coming. Yuna closed her eyes and ran through the plan one more time and checked every angle and every variable and every possible outcome. And when she was satisfied, she put the book away and went to sleep. Tomorrow was Thursday. Tomorrow her advanced xenochemistry class ended at the 14th hour. Tomorrow she would walk through the East Wing corridor alone. And tomorrow the hunters would finally make their move. She was ready above her in the monitoring room. The lead Keth operative watched her sleep and thought about how easy this would be, and how weak she looked, and how simple it would be to grab one small human girl and use her to control her father. Had no idea what was waiting for him, none of them did. The East Wing corridor was empty at 1400 hours, and that was exactly what everyone had planned for. Yuna walked alone, and her footsteps made soft sounds on the metal floor, and she counted the seconds in her head and waited for what she knew was coming. The lights died, emergency strips flickered to life along the baseboards and painted everything in shades of red and shadow, and the corridor that had been bright and safe became something else entirely, and most people would have frozen or panicked or screamed. Yuna Park stopped walking and set her bag down slowly and waited. The first Keth emerged from a maintenance hatch on her left, and he was tall and thin with skin that glowed pale blue in the darkness, and his eyes were solid black and designed to see in conditions exactly like these. The second and third came from hatches on her right, and they moved like hunters and spread out to block any escape, and their bioluminescent markings pulsed with colors that meant confidence and anticipation. The leader stepped forward, and his translator made his voice flat and mechanical, and he said, "Human female, you will come with us, and your father cooperation is required." Yuna tilted her head slightly and looked at each of them in turn, and took note of their positions and their weapons and their body language and the way they held themselves, like predators who had never met anything they could not catch. "And if I refuse," she said. The leader made a sound that might have been a laugh and said, "We are authorized to use necessary force, and you are one small Deathworlder, and we are 3 trained operatives with decades of experience, and you cannot possibly think that she moved." The first Keth was fast, and his species had evolved on a moon where survival meant quick reflexes and faster strikes. But Yuna was not trying to be faster. She was trying to be closer. She stepped inside his reach before he could react, and her foot hooked behind his knee and pulled, and her palm struck his chest and pushed, and physics did the rest, and he went down hard with his leg bent at an angle that legs were not supposed to bend. The second Keth raised his stun baton, and the weapon hummed to life with a crackling blue energy field, and he swung it at her head with a strike that would have knocked out any normal target. But Yuna was not where the baton was going. She had already moved, and she was low and inside his guard, and her elbow drove into his throat with a wet crunching sound, and he dropped the baton and grabbed at his neck and could not breathe, and could not scream, and could not do anything but fall. 2 seconds had passed. The leader stumbled backward, and his bioluminescent markings flashed red and orange with fear and disbelief, and he reached for the communicator on his belt, because this was not how it was supposed to go, and they needed backup, and they needed help. Yuna caught his wrist before he could activate the device. Her fingers wrapped around the joint and twisted, and the snap was very loud in the quiet corridor, and the leader made a high-pitched sound that his translator could not process, and fell to his knees. Yuna did not let go. She leaned close to his ear, and her voice was very quiet and very calm, and she said, "On Earth, we have a word for people who threaten someone's family." The leader looked up at her, and his black eyes were wide and wet, and he had hunted prey across a dozen worlds, and he had never been afraid before, and he was afraid now. "We call them mistakes," she said. She released his wrist, and he cradled it against his chest and whimpered, and she stood over him and looked down without anger or hatred or anything at all, really. And that was the most frightening part. "You will deliver a message," she said, "and you will tell whoever sent you that Yuna Park is not prey, and you will tell them that the next operative they send will not walk away. And you will tell them that if anyone touches my family, I will find them." The leader nodded frantically, and his markings had faded to a dull gray that meant submission and terror. Yuna stepped back and picked up her bag and looked at the 3 operatives on the ground, and the first one was unconscious, and the second one was gasping for air, and the third one was broken and beaten, and all of it had taken less than 5 seconds. She had been trained since childhood. Grandmother had started teaching her to fight before she could read, and her mother had taught her anatomy and pressure points, and her father had taught her physics and leverage, and the reclamation zones had taught her that mercy was a luxury that survivors could not always afford. But she had chosen to be merciful today. She had chosen to leave them alive, not because she was weak, but because dead operatives could not carry messages as she wanted. Whoever sent them to know exactly what had happened, and she wanted them to be afraid. The emergency lights still painted everything red, and Yuna looked up at the hidden camera in the ceiling panel, and she knew it was there because she had memorized the locations of every surveillance device in the East Wing. During her first week, she looked directly into the lens. Then she reached up and crushed it with her bare hand. The metal and glass crumpled like paper, and sparks flew, and the camera died, and Yuna felt something that might have been satisfaction. She walked down the corridor and destroyed every camera she passed, and there were 7 of them, and she had known about all of them, and she left a trail of broken lenses and shattered housings behind her. When she reached the end of the corridor, she stopped and looked back at the 3 Keth operatives, and they had not moved. And the second one was finally breathing again, but none of them were getting up any time soon. Remember, she said, and her voice carried through the red-lit darkness, and remember what happens when you hunt a Deathworlder. Then she walked away, and the shadow swallowed her, and the only sound was the soft hum of the emergency lighting and the ragged breathing of 3 hunters who had just learned that they were not the most dangerous things in the galaxy, not even close. Station Security Chief Alara had 4 arms, and she was using all of them to pull up data streams and cross-reference footage and try to understand what she was seeing. It was not possible. She played the recording for the 3rd time and watched the human girl disable 3 trained Keth operatives in 4.7 seconds, and it should not have been possible, and everything she knew about combat and biology and physics said it should not have been possible, but there it was. The holographic display showed Yuna Park moving like water and like smoke and like something that had no right to exist in a universe that made sense. And the Keth were not slow, and they were not weak, and they were professional hunters who had tracked and captured targets across the galaxy, and she had taken them apart like they were children. How did she do that? Asked Alara, and her voice was barely a whisper. Her assistant was a small furred creature named Pip, who had been working security for 30 years and had never seen anything like this. Either I do not know, said Pip, and I have reviewed the footage frame by frame, and she did not use any weapons, and she did not use any technology, and she just moved, and they fell. Alara shook her head and tried to process what she was seeing. And then the footage continued, and the human girl looked up at the camera, the hidden camera, the one that was embedded in a ceiling panel that looked exactly like every other ceiling panel, and the one that was not on any official station schematic, and the one that even most security staff did not know existed. The human girl looked directly into it and held its gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she reached up and crushed the lens with her bare fingers. Alara felt something cold move through her body, and it took her a moment to recognize it as fear play. The next sequence, she said, Pip pulled up the footage from the other cameras in the corridor, and one by one, they showed the same thing, and the human girl walked down the hallway and stopped at each hidden camera and looked at it and destroyed it, and she never hesitated, and she never searched, and she knew exactly where every single one was located. She knew, said Alara, and her voice was strange, even to her own ears, and she knew we were watching her. The footage ended with static and broken glass, and Alara sat very still and tried to understand what kind of creature they had allowed onto their station. Pull up her admission file, said Pip. Brought the file up on a secondary display, and Alara read through it quickly, and most of it was standard information, and name and age and species and homeworld and educational background, but there were gaps. Large sections of the file were marked with classification codes that Alara did not recognize, and when she tried to access them, the system denied her request and told her that authorization level 7 or higher was required. "I have level 6 clearance," said Alara. "And who has level 7, Pip?" Checked, and said only the Academy Director and the Galactic Council. Security Committee for a student file, asked Alara, and for a 17-year-old student file, yes, said. Pip. Alara leaned back in her chair and looked at the frozen image of Una Park on the display, and the girl looked so small and so young and so harmless, and that was the most disturbing part. "What do we know about Earth?" she asked. Pip pulled up the planetary database and said, "Earth is classified as a Category 12 death environment, and gravity at 1.0 standard, which is considered extreme, and atmosphere is oxygen. Nitrogen mixed with trace toxins and native life forms. Include apex predators in every ecosystem, and the planet experiences regular seismic events and volcanic activity and extreme weather patterns." "And stop," said Alara, "and I know all that, and what do we know about how humans are raised?" Pip was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Not much actually, and humans only made contact with the galactic community 40 years ago, and they are still considered a new species, and most of what we know comes from official channels, and there are rumors." "But what rumors?" "That Earth has mandatory survival training for all children," said Pip, "and that some regions are more dangerous than others, and that humans who grow up in what they call the reclamation zones are different. How Pip hesitated and then said, "Harder." Alara looked at the file again and saw that Una Park hometown was listed as Reclamation Zone 7 Korea, and she did not know exactly what that meant, but she was starting to understand. "This girl is not just from a Deathworld," said Alara quietly, "and she was trained there." The door to the security office opened and a medical technician rushed in, and her scales were flushed with stress colors, and she said, "The Keth operative is awake, and he is asking to speak with the director, and he says it is urgent." "What does he want to say?" asked Alara. The technician swallowed and said, "He says we do not understand what we are dealing with, and he says the syndicate sent them to test the human girl, and he says they wanted to see what a Deathworld child could do." "Now," asked Alara. "No, they know," said the technician, and her voice was shaking, "and he said to warn everyone, and he said she let them live on purpose, and he said she wanted them to deliver a message." "What message?" The technician looked at the frozen image of Una Park on the display, and the small quiet girl who had destroyed 3 hunters and 7 cameras and everything the station thought it knew about humans. She said, "The next ones will not be so lucky." Alara sat very still for a long time, and then she said, "Get me the director and tell him we have a situation." "What kind of situation?" asked Pip. Alara looked at the display one more time, and the human girl stared back at her with dark eyes that held no fear and no anger and nothing at all, really. And that was what frightened Alara most of all, the kind of situation that changes everything, she said. The Grand Assembly Chamber had not been used for an emergency session in 47 years, and now it was full. Representatives from 17 different species sat in their designated sections, and their translators hummed with whispered conversations. And their eyes kept drifting to the small figure seated alone at the center of the room. Una Park sat at a metal table with her hands folded in front of her, and she looked calm, and she looked patient, and she looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The Academy Director was a massive creature named Vorhan, with gray skin and 6 eyes and a voice like distant thunder, and he called the session to order, and the chamber fell silent. "We are here to address the incident that occurred yesterday in the East Wing corridor," said Vorhan, "and 3 individuals were injured, and 7 security devices were destroyed, and we must determine what happened and why, and what should be done about." Ida Velanthi, representative, stood, and her voice was high and sharp with anger, and she said, "What happened is obvious, and a human attacked 3 people and destroyed station property, and she should be expelled immediately." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. A Keth representative rose next, and his bioluminescent markings pulsed with complex patterns, and he said the three individuals who were injured were not innocent students, and they were syndicate operatives who attempted to kidnap Miss Park, and they have admitted this under questioning. The murmur changed tone and became confused, and uncertain. Verhan raised a massive hand for silence and said, "Miss Park, you have heard the accusations, and you have heard the defense, and do you have anything to say?" Yuna stood slowly, and she was so small compared to the massive chamber and the towering representatives and the weight of 17 species watching her every move. She said. The chamber was completely quiet. "My father is a physicist," said Yuna, and her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. "And my mother is a botanist, and they are good people who work hard and love their daughter and want nothing to do with weapons or wars or whatever the syndicate believes they can force from them." She paused and looked around the chamber and met the eyes of every representative in turn. "I came here to learn," she said, "and I came here to study, and I came here to prove that humans could be trusted among your children, and for 3 weeks I attended every class and completed every assignment and ate alone and spoke to almost no one, and I did everything I could to show that I was not a threat. But 3 operatives decided that I was valuable," said Yuna, "and 3 operatives decided that they could take me and use me as leverage against my family, and 3 operatives decided that I was prey." She was quiet for a moment, and the silence in the chamber was heavy and thick. "They were wrong," she said. The Keth representative shifted uncomfortably, and his markings flickered. "I want to be clear about something," said Yuna, and she turned slowly and looked at each section of the chamber in turn. "And on Earth we do not raise children to be victims, and we do not teach them to wait for rescue, and we do not tell them that someone else will keep them safe. Every human in this galaxy carries 10,000 years of adaptation to a world that tried to kill us every single day," she said. "And we learned to fight because fighting was how we survived, and we learned to be dangerous because dangerous things lived longer, and we learned that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself." She paused and let that sink in. "Those 3 operatives will recover," she said, "and I made sure of it, and I could have killed them, and it would have been easy, and I chose not to because I wanted them to deliver a message." "What message?" asked Vorhan. Yuna looked directly at him with her dark eyes that held something old and hard and patient. "That the next Deathworlder they threaten might not be as merciful as a 17-year-old exchange student," she said. The chamber erupted in noise, and representatives shouted over each other, and translators struggled to keep up, and Vorhan had to call for order 3 times before the room fell quiet again. A small representative from a species Yuna did not recognize stood and said, "This is exactly why humans should not be allowed in civilized space, and you are too violent and too dangerous, and you cannot be trusted." Yuna turned to look at the speaker and said, "You are afraid of me." Representative did not answer, but its body language said yes. Yuna nodded slowly and said, "That is fair, and I understand, but I want you to consider something." She walked forward until she was standing directly in front of the representative section, and she was tiny compared to them, and they could have crushed her without effort, and yet somehow she did not seem small. "At Ali was attacked yesterday," she said, "and 3 armed operatives tried to kidnap me, and for most of the species in this room, that would have been the end, and you would have been taken and used and discarded, and there would have been nothing you could do about it. But I am human," she said. "I am from Earth, and I was raised in the reclamation zones by a grandmother who survived the soul collapse, and a mother who fought off raiders with her bare hands, and a father who lost everything and rebuilt himself from nothing. I am not helpless," she said, "and I am not prey, and I am not something you can take and use and throw away." She turned back to face the full chamber. "You are right to be afraid of humans," she said, "and we are dangerous, and we come from a world that forged use in fire and pain and constant struggle, and we carry that world inside us wherever we go. But being dangerous does not mean being evil. she said. And being strong does not mean being cruel, and I could have killed those operatives, and I did not. And I could have kept fighting, and I did not. And I stopped when the threat was over, and I let them live, and I showed mercy. That is also what it means to be human, she said. The chamber was silent. Una returned to her table and sat down and folded her hands and waited. Vorhan looked at her for a long time, and then he said, "The Academy will take no action against Miss Park at this time, and the matter of the syndicate operatives will be referred to the appropriate authorities, and this session is adjourned." The representatives filed out slowly, and many of them looked at Una as they passed, and some looked angry, and some looked afraid, and some looked thoughtful. Tommy found her on the observation deck 3 hours later, and she was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and looking out at the stars. "So," said Tommy, and he sat down beside her in secret. "Badass." Una almost smiled and said, "My grandmother taught me to fight, and she said the universe is full of things that want to hurt you, and the only question is whether you are ready when they come. And are you?" asked Tommy, and ready. Una looked at him, and for a moment he saw past the quiet exterior and the careful control, and he saw something forged in the gravity wells and oxygen fires of a world the galaxy called death. And he saw someone who had been ready her whole life. "I am from Earth," she said simply, "and we are always ready." Tommy nodded, and they sat together in silence and watched the stars. And somewhere out in the darkness, the syndicate received a message from 3 broken operatives, and they learned what it really meant to hunt a Deathworlder they never tried again.